Dunham-Jones. Welcome to episode 20 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, a professor in the School of Architecture, where I direct the MS in Urban Design. If this is your first Redesigning Cities, check out our diverse and fascinating previous episodes on our website, YouTube channel, and most podcast platforms. Today is the final episode of Season 3. Thanks to the Speedwell Foundation, we've already started planning for Season 4, so see you back here in the fall. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to encourage all of you to post questions throughout the talk using the Q&A on the right side of your screen. You're welcome to use the event chat for comments and saying hi to friends, but we will only be moderating the Q&A for actual questions to our speakers. Please like questions from others that you would especially like to see answered, and we'd certainly love for you to tweet and Instagram and share whatever you'd like on social media. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Raphael Bostic and Dr. Catherine Ross to discuss redesigning cities to tackle structural racism. How can we undo the ways economic policies have contributed to structural racism, and how should we redesign cities to reflect and advance inclusive, equitable, and resilient economies? Raphael will kick us off with a presentation of his work at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta before Catherine leads their conversation on the topic. Afterwards, I'll moderate Q&A, and note, I will not be forwarding any questions to Raphael about interest rates. So just heads up, we need to keep the focus on the intersection of economics, policy, urban form, and racism. Now, it is really a great pleasure to introduce Catherine Ross, who I've had the pleasure of being a colleague with here at Georgia Tech for 20 years. I've been a fan of her leadership, whether it's advising the White House or leading the Georgia Regional Transportation Authority. She is Regents Professor and Harry West Professor of City and Regional Planning and Civil and Environmental Engineering, and directs the Center for Quality Growth and Regional Development here at Georgia Tech. Her book, Mega Regions and Global Competitiveness, is a leading reference on emerging geographies, bringing regions and cities together to address multidisciplinary issues of transportation, resilience, analytics, and performance management. Dr. Raphael Bostic became the 15th president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in 2017. In June of 2020, he posted a historic letter on the bank's website titled, "A Moral and Economic Imperative to End Racism." He wrote that systemic racism is a yoke that drags on the American economy. And he talked of how the Fed needs to address this through its mission to promote the health and stability of the U.S. financial system. The very next day, I started lobbying Catherine and Raphael to join in today's talk and elaborate on what this means for redesigning cities. Raphael earned a PhD in economics from Stanford University and his undergraduate degree from Harvard. Before joining the bank, he was a professor of public policy at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He also served at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and spent several years as an economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Raphael helps guide the Atlanta Fed's multifaceted program aimed at enhancing economic mobility and resilience. He is particularly interested in working with policymakers and researchers to help find ways to make the economy work for every American. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Raphael.
Well, thank you, Professor Dunham-Jones. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Georgia Tech and the Speedwell Foundation for inviting me to speak. And for those of you who are watching, you should know that it was literally the next day that she started lobbying us to put this program together. So I'm very glad that we've been able to do it. I actually have to say I'm especially grateful that this session has given me an opportunity to step a little bit out of my central banker role, that formal role, and return to the space in which I've lived for the better part of the preceding 16 years, which is urban planning. I taught in the USC Price School, as Professor Dunham-Jones noted, but what you might not know is that the school's name before that was the School of Policy, Planning, and Development. And my work sat at the intersection of all three of those things. And so I spent a lot of time engaging with urban planners and designers, not only because I liked my faculty colleagues and learned a lot from them, but also because our real estate development program had a dual degree option with planning. And some of my best students had that dual degree. So I'm feeling pretty familiar today and in a very, very good way. But before I go on, let me give you the standard Fed disclaimer. What I'm going to talk about today are my thoughts and views, and you should not assume that they reflect the views of my colleagues on the Federal Open Market Committee or the views of anyone at the Atlanta Fed. All right, so to set the stage, I'd like us to return to our earliest planner and design roots and focus on this question. What are we planning for? Or what is it that we are trying to accomplish? Now, when I think about this, there's one phrase that comes to my mind most often. And it's actually the same words that come to mind when I think of my current missions organizational objectives. And it's maximizing opportunity. One half of our dual mandate is maximizing employment in the aggregate. As a practical matter, this depends on the environment and infrastructure that exists for providing people access to that opportunity. If the prevailing foundation only allows 5 million people to be productive, then maximum employment will be 5 million, regardless of whether the population is 5 million, 50 million, or 500 million. But this assumes that the environment and infrastructure is fixed and can't be changed or improved. Now, if this isn't true, if change is possible, then by accepting that 5 million number, or whatever it happens to be, we are potentially leaving large numbers of people on the sideline. And this means that institutional or structural barriers that prevent people from accessing opportunity constrain us and prevent us from achieving a true maximum employment. In turn, we would be essentially leaving people behind, and in so doing, robbing the economy of potential growth, potential productivity, and a great deal of talent. Now, urban design and planning play a big role in creating the environment and infrastructure that people in cities face. And thus, you are key players in whether people, and I mean all people, have access to opportunity. Planning and urban design issues, such as regulations, building standards, zoning, community meetings, public spaces, and connectivity, among others, make a big difference and can be barriers as well as facilitators. And that brings us to today's topic, redesigning cities to tackle systemic racism. Now, the case of systemic racism is a barrier to every American having true access to opportunity is pretty clear. Take housing as an example. A number of unfair policies and private practices, some well-known and others not, have locked out many American families. Richard Rothstein, Keeanga Yamada Taylor at Princeton, and other scholars and community builders have detailed the many forms that racism in housing has taken. Early public housing was segregated. Many local governments imposed racially segregated zoning. Real estate covenants and professional realtors groups ensured that a deed could not be transferred to an owner of another race. And the government explicitly refused to back mortgages for people of color and support the development of integrated communities. White residents fought to preserve segregated neighborhoods through persecution and even violence. And many moved to the suburbs as a result of deliberate blockbusting by real estate speculators. The GI Bill is another example. It was the foundation of the American middle class and a keystone to building intergenerational wealth for millions of families. These families bought modestly priced houses, which appreciated in value substantially, creating a nice nest egg. But that opportunity was largely off limits to Black Americans. And this choked off the ability of communities of color to build wealth and to pass it on to subsequent generations. Other practices have also adversely affected wealth for people of color. At our recent housing-focused racism in the economy session, Andre Perry of the Brookings Institution reported on research examining race-based differences in the valuation of housing. His team estimated that, all things being equal, homes in Black majority neighborhoods are undervalued by about $48,000 per home. Now that translates into about $156 billion in lost equity if we use 2017 dollars. And that is enormous wealth that has been stripped from Black Americans. And this has real downstream implications. Perry estimates that this $156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black businesses and over 8 million four-year degrees. Now, to be sure, mob violence, restricted covenants, and racial zoning are mostly relics. Still, their important imprint remains on the current built environment. Now, you just have to look at Atlanta today. As I'm sure you're all aware, there are patterns of segregation and disinvestment in the city's communities. And these exist and persist despite what some would say has been a decline in broad-based resident racial bias. I think this could be taken as a sign of the lingering effects of systemic racism in housing. Now, this dynamic is emblematic of the challenge that we collectively face. How can we create an environment where everyone has true access to opportunity, given the history of structural racism and its persistent effects? Now, let me close by talking briefly about what the Federal Reserve is doing on this front. Now, there are really four categories. The first is research, and we do a ton of research that looks at disparities and tries to understand their root causes and propose solutions to them. We convene meetings that focus on these topics. I mentioned the Racism in the Economy seminar series. The one nice thing about the Federal Reserve is when we invite people to come, they usually show up. And that gives us an opportunity to bring together people who may not have spoken to each other before and create conversations that haven't happened before, all with the goal of finding solutions that may not have been discovered before. A third thing that we do is we promote things that work. One of my best and favorite parts of this job is to go around the 6th District, the southeastern United States, and talk to people in communities and find out what they're doing and find out things that they have found to be effective and successful. Once we hear those things, we have a natural platform to promote them and to make sure others know that they are out there. And then finally, we also advise. One thing that I've seen very much, particularly during the pandemic, is that public officials and policymakers at the federal, state, and local levels are all looking for solutions. And they have reached out to us to see what we know and what ways that we might be able to help them. Now, those are four critical ways beyond monetary policy that we can really make a difference in this space. And I would also point to two other areas where we play a role. First, we are a bank regulator. And so we have responsibility for the Community Reinvestment Act. And this act calls on us to ensure that capital is deployed throughout a banking institution's service area. And this includes in lower income communities. Now, some of you might know that the Fed and other financial regulators are updating the CRA. And it's my hope that this update will be refined to encourage longer term investments in disadvantaged people and communities. And finally, as Professor Dunham-Jones noted, our bank has chose several years ago to highlight improving economic mobility and resilience as a strategic priority. And so we are looking at ways to deploy the resources of our entire bank in ways that promote equity and opportunity for all and push against barriers to those things. Now, I could say a lot more on this, but rather than do that, I'm going to invite Dr. Ross to join me so we can make this more of a conversation. So Dr. Ross, come on back on and let's talk about things.
Raphael, today we are shifting to talk about redesigning cities to tackle systemic racism. We have known each other for 25 years, and I have seen you bring leadership to a number of different organizations and operate in a number of different contexts. I find you to be approachable, thoughtful, and flexible, and I think these are a few of the qualities that make you an excellent candidate to lead the Atlanta Fed. Importantly, people that have worked for you and worked with you, and I count myself among them, would also agree that you bring a commitment, a strong sense of fair play, and a keen dedication to making progress and pushing forward. This is a great backdrop. Thank you for your willingness to share your thoughts on redesigning cities to tackle racism. And now a few questions for you. You discussed why the Federal Reserve is interested in racial disparities in housing and the economy. Can you talk a bit more about that and share what the Federal Reserve has been doing in that regard, in those regards?
Well, sure. And first, I just want to say thank you for the kind words. And I'm a little chagrined that you mentioned 25 years. I stopped saying numbers because people can do math, and that always is a little distressing. So I appreciate that. Look, in terms of what we're doing, we are doing so many things, and it makes me very excited to see us deployed. I mentioned the convening, and I hope that all of you are subscribed to our Racism in the Economy webinar series. This is something that we started in October, and one of the things that we are really trying to highlight is the fact that racism is not just a moral issue. It is an economic issue, and its presence has prevented us from realizing the full potential of our economy. And so we actually just had a session 2 days ago, or maybe that was yesterday. I lose track of all these things. On the economics profession and racism in that profession and ways that it's holding us back. So we're doing those sorts of things. Another area I would point to that my bank has been very active in is really tracking what's happening through the pandemic to make sure that we understand the differential experiences that lower income and minority communities have had relative to how COVID-19 has impacted it and the implications of that for their future and their trajectories. I would also say that we've really started a robust research agenda as well. We're trying to understand the ways that the structures and the systems are not working for people, and to really highlight solutions to try to make a positive change in that regard. So we're doing a ton at the system level. We're also doing a lot at the bank level. One other thing I would point out, because there's a lot of stuff that we are doing, is we are trying to find partners throughout the country to work with to try to help advance the cause. So one partner that we're working with is the Markle Foundation, and there's something that we've put together called the Rework America Alliance. We're really trying to strengthen pathways for people to build skills that allow them to be competitive and attractive to employers who are developing the jobs of tomorrow. And when I think about this, if you look at what's happened during the pandemic, job loss in African American communities and in other minority communities has been substantial and actually disproportionate to what we've seen in other places. So those people are really going to need to be able to pivot with their skills if they want to remain attached to the economy, and we're going to do all we can to make that happen.
I have had the opportunity to catch a number of the programs. I think linking racism and the economy is just a powerful joining, and it's so pervasive that the idea that you would tackle this in the way that you have, I think, has really raised consciousness around the importance of thinking about racism within the context of what does it mean relative to our economic development and growth. So I applaud that linkage. I thought it's really a very special opportunity you created in that regard.
Well, I would thank you for that. And I would say one thing, my favorite part of this series is how blunt all of our speakers have been. And we've really invited them to tell us what they really think, how they really think it, and not to be polite because we're the Fed. And I think we've really succeeded in finding people who have been willing to do that. And it's meant that our conversations, I think, have been more real than many have expected. But to your point, it allows us to be thoughtful and to force people to really think hard about what's going on and why we should care about this.
No, I agree. I think about how much information there is in the bank and the things that you do. And when I think about a regional Fed like yours, you have considerable capacity and you engage in extensive amounts of research. How have you used that capacities, these capabilities, on problems that are really linked to or focused on racial disparities, housing or other issues? How have you used that capacity to examine those, to impact those, to discuss those?
Well, one of my soapbox issues is that too often researchers do research. I was a professor for a long time, and I had a lot of colleagues who did really excellent research. We got them published in journals, and then they just stayed in the journal. And real policymakers and people who are really doing things never heard about the research and never heard about the studies. So when I got here, I really wanted us to find ways to have our work be accessible and known by people who are actually grappling with issues in the field. And I've got to say, I've been super gratified. We have an excellent outreach team that we've built up over the last few years, and they are getting us out in front of people to really help those who are trying to make a difference actually make that difference. So again, I'll use the pandemic as an example. We have developed a series of webinars for minority small businesses who are trying to survive, to try to give them pictures of things that we have seen in research that can actually work. Right before I got here, and in Atlanta was ground zero for a lot of the discussions around eviction and how eviction policies were disadvantaging minorities and lower income people. That was work that was done by Laura Raymond at Georgia Tech with folks at our institution here, and it changed the national dialogue at the urban level around how should we think about eviction? Do we even know what's happening here? And what things might we want to do to make a change? And then I would also point to research that's been done in our shop around what we call the benefits cliff. So if you think about sort of housing vouchers or food stamps or the child tax credit and things like that, they're all individual benefit programs. Now, one feature that we have in those is that if you earn an extra dollar, you lose the dollar in most programs of benefit. So you're left whole, you're left neutral. But if that person is participating in 3 or 4 benefits programs, they need support in multiple actions, gaining $1, they may lose 4, which can leave them actually worse off and ultimately lock them into a cycle of dependence. And that dependence is not actually driven by the person. The person is actually responding to the incentives that we have set up. So one of the things that we've tried to do is make this clear. We call it advancing careers is the initiative, because we want the incentives to be in place such that people have an incentive to advance their careers, to get to that next trajectory and that next level of professionalism to where they have a more standard and more sustainable potential for life. One of the things that we started doing math. So if you start to advance your careers, you do the training, you start to get to extra income, and then you're worse off, how long would it be until you were back to break even?
Yeah.
In some instances, the answer was 12 years, 15 years, or even more. And so you step back and say, I've got someone, they may have children, they may be taking care of older people in their family. They can't afford to wait 15 years to break even. And so we really are locking them in. And one of the things that I have to say that's made me very excited, as we've gone around the country and started talking to policymakers, many of them were not so aware of this, but the appetite to try to do something different has been tremendous. And so we are really very much in the policy space and taking our research and knowledge to try to make change.
You know, it's interesting because policies are developed in silos. Oftentimes, the linkages and the impacts that occur are hidden, not recognized, not analyzed, not referenced, and so that ability to sort of link it so they understand what, in fact, is a lack of enfranchising people is really what's happening. Is something that ought to be taken into consideration. I've been very interested, and if you look at public policy, as you know, that's sort of what our model has been that way, because we don't have full account of what the investments are and the costs relative to the people who are receiving services, as you know.
And that's exactly right. You know, I think about homelessness as an issue.
Yes.
So, you know, the homeless interventions that work are building housing and making more units available. Most of the savings in cost, though, is going to happen in healthcare, because they're not being taken, homeless people are not being taken to the emergency room, and in policing costs, because there aren't those issues around vagrancy and people loitering and that kind of thing. If you look at a city budget, the housing budget and the health budget and the police budget are in totally different spaces.
Yeah.
And so the housers don't want to do it because they're not going to see any of the benefit. And the health people don't really see that they're positioned to advocate for a housing budget. And so we have the solutions that are well known, but because of how we are organized, it makes it much harder for us to realize those solutions.
In fact, often they work against each other. So I think the point is well made in that regard. So let's change discussion and shift in a slightly different direction, reflecting on race and climate, which we know really influences urban design. But that has traditionally been left out of bounds for Federal Reserve officials like you, for example. This is particularly true for race. So what's behind this new willingness, and I'll frame it in that way, to publicly discuss and draw attention to racism in the economy?
Well, I think for me, I reflect on my job. And I get this question a lot, sort of, why are we talking about this and why now? You know, when I look at my job and the things that I talk about, they're all about things that affect how our economy functions and operates. And if I see there are places or areas where things are not operating or functioning as well as they could, then I want to talk about that, because that has implications for our ability to execute on our mandate, which is to achieve maximum employment and to have a strong and resilient economy. So I talk a lot about rural broadband, because if we don't have high-speed internet in these rural places, they can't attract businesses and people will not want to locate there. Their economies are going to be weaker. I talk about quality of education and how we have to have good schools that generate skills for kids so that they can actually do the jobs that we need to have done. And in the very same way, you know, I talk about racism, because racism is another dimension whereby people's potential is curtailed or constrained. So I see this as part and parcel of all the types of things that really affect how an economy performs. And if we want the economy to be better, these are dimensions that we should focus on to try to make those things better. Now, why now? You know, it's an interesting question. What I would say is I saw in the aftermath of George Floyd's death a new appreciation and a new openness to acknowledge that there are these issues around race in this country. You know, I've talked to business leaders across the 6th District, indeed across the country, and they've expressed and demonstrated a greater willingness to actually recognize that they are part of the system and thus they could be part of the solution. And that's a sea change. That, frankly, I've never seen that before in my career. But for me, I felt that this was an opportunity to really step into this and to try to have different sorts of conversations. And for me, I would say that I have seen businesses do things and and take pledges and be willing to act in ways that they never have before. That's one of the reasons why I've really tried to have our conversation be focused much more on what the solutions should look like, what actions might we take moving forward to try to make progress, rather than just dwelling on the fact that there are problems, because those problems have been around for a long time. Dwelling on them is fine, but ultimately we have to change behavior if we're going to change outcomes.
Well, I agree, and I still applaud the fact that the Federal Reserve, the Atlanta Fed, is taking a bold step, a very bold step, when we focus on race and raise it up from the perspective of what are the implications and impact on the economy, and what sectors, what communities in the economy are affected, and how are those impacts different? And let's talk about that and what we might do relative to policy development, trying to level the playing field and really enhancing opportunities, which is another point that you reference constantly. And it's it's exciting to anticipate the potential that we have to create opportunity, particularly for those who have few, if no other options in many instances. I talk about broadband, and we can talk about that, but if you're in a rural community, in many instances, and they don't even have phones. I mean, the kinds of phones that would allow you to access broadband technology. So this notion of technology and deepening our commitment to it is really important in terms of, again, looking at equity and bringing more of the question of race in certain communities into our public policy development. If you think about the major elements of racial inequities and disparities in economic outcomes, what do you really want people to understand or to grasp? What elements do people not fully understand or don't know about at all?
So, one of the things that's been super interesting over my journey over the last year is that I found that people are not really as aware of the history of policy, practice, and experience in this country for minorities more generally. I think a lot of people I found a lot of people have not been aware that when Social Security was established, African Americans were largely excluded from that for decades. And so as they became older, they were not able to tap into Social Security and thereby save funds that then they could pass on to their children and grandchildren. I talked about the GI Bill in my opening remarks. This is another one where African Americans were locked out. You think about the FHA policy, the Federal Housing Administration, and how they did redlining as a codified rule. And all of these historical realities still shape what we see today. And for me, I talk about this in this way. Many African Americans, many Latinos, many Asians, their experiences today, their station in life, is a direct byproduct of things that their parents and grandparents were not allowed to do. And yet they continue to carry those things. So knowing the history, I think, is an important piece to really viewing today's people in a different light. A second thing I would say is thinking about what true access to opportunity looks like. And maybe being more open to the idea that your lived experience may not be the lived experience of others in this country. And that if we're really going to find solutions, we actually have to step deep into those other experiences, really understand them, so that we can come together on a pathway toward progress. And then a third thing that I talk about a lot, and I think this is an important element as well, and some of it comes from my psychology background, is when people are under stress, they actually make worse decisions. And it's not that they're not smart, or it's not that they don't have insights. It's actually that they're under stress. And there's a lot of research that's been done that shows that this is true for rich people, this is true for poor people, this is true for people from every walk of life, and it's the stress. So when you look at populations, one thing you got to ask is how much stress is in that population? How much precariousness is there? because if you see a lot of precariousness, you're going to see suboptimal decisions. But it's not because the people are flawed in a particular way. It's because the stress does things to you. And so, like, one of the reasons I worked in housing is because, you know, if you don't know where you're going to lay your head next week, like, that's a lot of stress. And if we can take that off the table as something you have to worry about, now you can devote your energies and your focus on other things, start to do those investments, and have a more positive outcome, a more strategic approach to life. And so we think about, you know, African Americans and Latinos and others. Housing and housing stability is just harder, and it's a more significant issue. And so how we deal with that is something that we just have to figure out how to do. Because the goal is to reduce the stress, is to reduce the chaos, to eliminate all that stuff so that people can just live.
I think about, thank you for bringing stress into it. A lot of the narrative in recent times has been made by people who make the observation that my decision is, am I going to pay the rent or buy groceries or buy school supplies for my kid, or the kinds of things that I think would epitomize a tremendous amount of stress, having to figure out which of those you do without, since all of them are extremely important. So I think that observation is a really critical one to make, and it's one we don't often put in our discussions or have in our discussions. We have these big open discussions that we've been having recently. Those kinds of issues often don't make it into our exchanges. So thank you for pointing that out. If you think about the design of cities, and you've talked a bit about this, talk about the physical arrangement of neighborhoods and workplaces, green spaces, schools, and other institutions that influence economic outcomes, particularly for minority communities. I frequently offer the observation that transportation is economic development. And if you don't think that's true, try to have development, redevelopment, any kind of development without it. You'd find it very difficult to do. So these linkages are there, and the lack of them begin to shape the physical environments that we live in and the opportunities that we have. Would you talk a bit about that?
Well, you provided a great introduction to this, which is, you know, economies are about connections and about people being able to get to the places they need to get to, information getting to the places it needs to get to, and goods getting to the places that they need to get to. And much of how we have developed in our urban spaces, there are barriers between places that can make it hard for people to get to the workplace, or goods to get to people, or information to flow, such that we have networks that allow people to know what it needs to be known. And the built environment actually contributes to this explicitly. So if you think about sort of where high-cost housing gets built versus low-cost housing, what kind of activities are allowed to be located next to each other, how do we think about commercial activity or transit's location, like all those things actually play a significant role in the explicit built environment. But, you know, one thing that I learned in my last couple of years at USC is that there's also a lot of implicit barriers that are out there. There are many implicit barriers where people take signals when they look at the stores or the signs or the types of benches. Like, there are many implicit signals that people can see and say, well, this really isn't a place for me. Well, this is really meant for people of a different background. And so we can have exclusion from space and place in ways that are not explicit. So thinking hard about like what those signals might look like. We did a whole conference. It was a multi-day conference on public spaces and the use of public spaces. And a lot of the discussion there was, you know, public isn't always public. Like, public can mean different things in different contexts, and how we think about that is really important. So you know, I think that there's a lot of focus that needs to be made on this, and there's actually a lot that we've learned. And this is another thing where I think that the scholarship can inform practice, but also practice can inform scholarship. So finding out what communities have been successful at creating more inclusive public spaces, and what kind of policies and practices might allow neighborhoods to be accessible to everyone. This is a theme that Atlanta has carried in the years I've been here. Trying to make every neighborhood for every Atlantan, that's hard, and it requires attention and focus. But I do think that that effort, well, first of all, I think it's possible, but it's really going to require drive, commitment, and a vision that is clearly articulated and resourced sufficiently.
And it strikes me that different communities hear information, they want to receive information in different ways that reflect the social interaction that they typically engage in their community, their neighborhood. And so there's ample room for distinction. We don't have to have a one size fits all, one mode fits all, as the case may be. So I think looking for those distinctions are important, and bringing those into the decisions we make about the communities, the policies that we actually embrace is really important. I'm struck by this bias notion. Lots of attention recently on implicit and explicit bias. It's really an interesting exercise to sit down and reflect on your biases, many of which you aren't always aware of. I've taken a couple of courses and had a number of experiences, and I was really shocked to find out how I viewed things without knowing that was how I was viewing things. So this notion of bias and the assumptions that we have about each other simply because we don't stand in each other's place or have a reference to assessing that or intelligent about how that operates is really a part of moving this agenda along relative to structural racism, systemic racism, I think.
And one thing that's really interesting on that point, there's been a lot of psychological research which shows that people are ingrained to have bias. Like, it's not something that you can really avoid. It is part of our species and how we've grown up. And they've shown through studies, you can just put pictures to young people and they will have reactions and responses in ways on things that they may not have actually been told anything about. So that's actually a pretty significant thing. This issue that you mentioned about voice and about different modes, to me, it really struck a chord in the sense that it really speaks to the importance of diversity and making sure you have enough diversity in your institution such that you have the capability to deliver on all those different modes. I call myself an old person. So I know that young people today, they get their information in a different way than I do. They access different websites and other things than I do. And so if I just provide information on the ways that I get the information, they're going to miss it. And there may be some important things that I also don't find out because I'm not on those alternative modes. So we need to make sure that we surround ourselves with a diverse set of people that can reach into all of those different spaces so that we are fully informed and can make the best policy judgments that are possible.
And as a result, maybe achieve more effective policy development because we do have information.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the hope.
It is. Continuing. What do you think are the fundamental ways that architects, planners, policymakers can use their expertise to improve economic circumstances for Black and Brown communities?
So, that's a really broad-based question, and for me, I think about this in a couple of ways. So, one is to really try to understand what Black and Brown communities want and what they need, and then embed that into your approaches to doing your work, whether it be planning or design or whatever it is. Be clear on what you're actually trying to accomplish, and don't necessarily assume that you know the answer to those things. And one of the things I have regularly found is that when I've talked to people in communities as part of my research, they always tell me things that I'm surprised by or didn't expect or didn't know. And so if we want our policies and our standards and our regulations to be maximally effective, we actually need to know what effective looks like to the people who are going to be living in that. And that's going to be very important. I also think that there are ways to use your technology and your expertise to help communities see where opportunities are. Like you actually have a broader, in many regards, a broader perspective on how the world can work than what many in communities have actually lived or conceived of. And so it allows you to in some ways, be a guiding light to really unlock people's dreams and broaden what they think the possible is. And so use that knowledge, your talents, to expose people to different things, and then take them along on your journey as you try to craft a set of foundational rules and policies that are going to help communities evolve and grow. So I actually think there's a lot there, and it's all based in your abilities, your training, and your skills, coupled with an openness to hearing voices from across the entire range of the communities that you work in.
And as a professional, the challenge, and historically we haven't been great as we might be in this regard, is to go into a community with a preconceived notion. I have my bag of tools and analytics, and let me tell you how this ought to go forward, how it ought to be designed, where the garden ought to go, where the school needs to go, as opposed to listening to people who have lived there and understand that environment in ways that you can't possibly understand it, because the familiarity isn't what they have and isn't the kind of information that they value. So again, I think you've made a really important point, and that's something we can, sort of planning forward with, and then letting the width lead. That leading voice oftentimes ought to be that community voice, ought to be
Yes.
The voice of people who reside in a particular place. Go ahead. You're going to make a comment.
And you just reminded me of something. When I was first a professor at USA, I used to teach a class on affordable housing. And I had students who were in there, and they saw themselves of learning the tools so they could go into neighborhoods as if they were riding on a white horse. That they had the answers, and they were going to provide the solutions and save the day, and everything would be wonderful, and people would be cheering them as they came in. And I had to tell them, in many of these communities, and this gets back to history, many people have gone before on the white horse, and it hasn't turned out that well for people in that community. And so understanding that history of being burned or being taken advantage of, and the skepticism that generates, is an important reality in serving in many minority communities. Dr. Rush, you work in transportation. You know how many interstate highways went through vibrant African American communities in the name of redevelopment.
Right.
That's a scarring thing that people remember, and so anyone who comes after that will have to acknowledge that and embrace that reality if they're really going to make the positive change that they're actually hoping to make. So it's a really important point.
Yeah, it is. And armed with to go back to some of your opening comments, a good historical understanding of what has gone on, and an ear and a willingness to listen, I think, are critical tools for students and for ourselves as we continue to try to move forward with regard to reducing structural and systemic racism. Let's talk about the affordable housing crisis for a moment, and think about the interplay between the public and the private sector, and how we might address the affordable housing crisis. And maybe even race enters into that discussion or not. I'm not sure. I would leave that up to you. But I would like for you to share some thoughts you might have about the interplay between the public and the private sector, and how we begin to make progress relative to meeting the affordable housing needs that are just skyrocketing.
Well, when I think about affordable housing and the challenges that it poses, particularly in fast-growing places like Atlanta, one of the realities is just that the public sector by itself is not going to be able to produce enough units to cover the increased demand and make sure that we don't wind up in an auction situation where too many people are bidding on too few units, because we know how that's going to turn out. And those that don't have the most resources are going to lose, and then they're going to wind up having to live much further away from their jobs and the neighborhoods that they have historically been in. So we're going to need to have the private sector as our participant. And for me, and this has actually been very interesting here in Atlanta, the private sector is actually more visible than in other places where I've lived on a public policy front. The challenge I think we've had is really being clear on really a game plan, like a strategy. What are we asking the private sector to do? I think there's a willingness on their part to participate, but they're not experts in housing. They're not experts in planning. They're not experts in design. And so without clear guideposts, I think we benefit from their resources less than we could. So for me, I think there's a lot to be done there. And look, if you think about what companies have done in some of the highest cost places in this country, think about Apple in Silicon Valley. If you think about Microsoft in Seattle, they have now stepped into the housing area. They are pledging money to build housing. They are actually devoting land to the housing of their employees, and they're investing in transportation solutions to make housing in other places more viable. All of these are private sector initiatives, and you think about inclusionary zoning as another example. Inclusionary, where for every building that's built, some fraction is reserved to be affordable. That started in the West Coast, at least, as a private sector suggested solution, because businesses there were realizing that the high cost of housing was making their location disamenity from a competitive perspective. So the private sector can be a source of ideas as well as capital, and they should be encouraged to participate in those conversations as much as possible.
I would agree. I'm struck by a number of experiences I've had with new development, urban revitalization, where there were particular goals and commitments as a part of the financing and the passing of the legislation to allow development to move forward, the Beltline, and many other examples, where there's clearly a target relative to the amount or commitment to maintaining affordable housing, but oftentimes it dissipates. And we find out because of the market and policies that were not as effective, the affordable housing piece of it slips off the table for a variety of reasons. Any thoughts about what the federal or what other tools we might have to try to prevent those kinds of situations?
Yeah, so
I'm putting you on the point here just a bit, you'll notice.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is this is an enduring problem. Look, land use is local,
Right.
And the other problem is that the development and the evolution of a neighborhood happens over many, many years, and often can span mayoral administrations and council terms and that kind of thing. So you really need to think about how do you create a vision that can span across political change. And for me, I think some of the evidence would suggest that having a strong neighborhood voice that can play that role of memory and really demand accountability and that longer-term commitment can be important. That requires, to some extent, robust community-based organizations and some committed community leaders who are willing to play that leadership role. And that's something that, as I've gone around the country, that's made a huge difference. And I'm referring a lot to my pre-Fed days when I was a researcher like you guys, and trying to figure out what works. Having a strong community voice is one of those things that can be particularly important. And you actually see that here in Atlanta. If you think about the Eastlake neighborhood, one of the reasons that Eastlake turns out the way that it did and was so participatory for its residents in some of the investments was because there were loud voices that really demanded respect. And that's an important history to understand. I've had former Mayor Shirley Franklin tell me stories about some of the efforts to invest and change Eastlake. And she says there were some hard conversations, but they were necessary conversations. And so those are the sorts of things I think that are particularly important.
I think your point relative to the tenure, how long it takes over time for some of these developments to come online, means that you have to have a way to have metrics and measurements that occur over time. We often get focused on the here and the now, and the kinds of vigilance and metrics that you need over time to see if we are in fact meeting our commitment often are not something that gets integrated or is not on the table. So I think this idea of verification as we move along is an important one. And
so that's an important but that's an important role for you, I think, and for universities, because and planning and design, urban design programs, because you do actually have that longer term continuity,
we do.
and can be a focal point for reporting and tracking and really articulating how progress is proceeding over time. I think about, in, say, New York City, for example, at NYU, the Furman Center does this for neighborhoods. And they have a large report every year, what's the state of every neighborhood in New York. And that becomes a benchmark for assessing and driving conversations in neighborhoods. Universities across the country can play that role, and Georgia Tech has done that in many instances as well.
Yeah, we embrace that opportunity, and thank you for pointing it out. It's a really important opportunity for us to meet and to see as a part of what we do. We are, after all, a public institution, and even private ones, I would suggest, have some responsibility in that regard. Raphael, this has been just an excellent conversation for me to have the opportunity to have you share a lot of your experience and I think a lot of guidance as you think about we think about moving forward in this whole question of systemic racism and how we can begin to tackle it on a number of different levels. So I think now we're going to move into the section that allows our audience to pose questions to us, and Ellen is going to handle that for us. So thank you very much. I sure enjoyed the opportunity to speak with you and have that conversation.
I just so enjoyed being a fly on the wall, just listening to the two of you. It was absolutely fantastic. We have a lot of questions that range really from sort of basic definitions to some specific questions relative to the Fed and accounting, and then also some questions on urban design. So I'm going to start with actually the question that kind of got the most likes, so clearly there's a lot of people kind of wondering this, is just how do you measure racism? Quantitatively? I mean, is there a consensus on how to measure it? Is it an intangible liability? And if it is measurable, kind of what is the end goal? What satisfies the notion that there is no more racism? So that kind of just fundamental question in the research world and at the Fed. How do we do this?
So there are a couple of ways to answer this. So one I would say is racism is characterized by policies and practices where the main driver of differential treatment and outcome is race. And so as one example, when I was an assistant secretary at HUD over the Office of Policy Development and Research, we did studies to determine whether there was racism and discrimination in housing policy. And what we would do is we would send two people to the same unit that was open for rent, or we would have them call a landlord or apply for a mortgage. One applicant would be a white female, one applicant would be a black female. And we would do this over and over and over and over again, just track what the response was. Were they told that they could come see the unit? Were they told that there wasn't available? Were they asked for more information? And if you see a difference from identical people where the only difference is race, that's a sign that there's racism at play, that there's discrimination that's occurring. And you can do this in a host of areas, and that can be very, very empirical. Another example, we actually just did let me actually just talk more generally. So there are lots of other studies, for example, where people will apply for jobs. And the only difference in the resumes is the name that is at the top of the CV. And what they find is that names that, quote, sound African American or sound Latino, they get far fewer callbacks. And the only difference in those is the perceived race. Right? Those are things that really we can identify and demonstrate as racist or racism. And that is in policy and practice where race may not be explicitly called out. Like in the old days, you could have redlining where it says if there are more than X black people in the neighborhood, we're not going to lend there. Like this is not even about that. This is something where you can actually quantify it and measure it. Now, you asked a question about sort of what to do about it. That last question is, can you be in a world where there is no racism? That's a deeper question. And, for me, I actually think about it differently. I think we want to make sure that it is hard to be racist. We want to have policies and practices where, regardless of what an individual's impulses might be, the policies and practices don't allow those impulses to be determinative. So I think about, say, appraisals, for example, and there's a proposal that is out there right now to say that, so typically with appraisals, what will happen is that an appraiser will, as part of their process, go into the house and walk through it. And there have been studies that have, and experiences that have shown that if you have pictures of African Americans on the mantle, the house is assessed to be valued at a lower amount than if the picture is of a white family, if there's no picture up there at all. So people are now starting to explore whether there are practices for doing appraisals that don't require someone to actually go into the house. Like that's a way where, regardless of what the impulse is, if you can have a practice that makes that impulse not really matter, then you get to a more dispassionate or less biased type of approach. So that's the type of thing that most policymakers are trying to get to try to find policies that are somewhat insulated from the biases of particular individuals. And it's not always an easy thing to do, but ultimately I think that's where we need to get to. Because as I was talking with Dr. Ross, we all come with biases, right? We all will carry our biases, and it's going to be very, very difficult to have every person check every bias every time they do something. That's asking a lot of people. So if you can get the process to really take the biases further away from the decision-making locus, that will get you to better outcomes.
So just a quick comment, and I'll try to pick up where Dr. Bostic left off. And I'll give you a transportation analogy. At the end of the day, you have to measure what comes out of the tailpipe. And so you can have a process and you can have an official say, well, we followed the process. But at the end of the day, if over time, planning year after planning year, certain communities are underfunded, don't have an equitable share of the transportation dollar, it suggests there's some other issues that warrant investigation. And these oftentimes are not hard. You just have to measure it. We start at the top and don't always worry about what comes out at the end. I'm suggesting let's look at what comes out of the tailpipe, the end of it, and ask, over time, does this suggest there are considerations that may have racial, maybe based in racial kinds of beliefs that really mean a community is being disenfranchised? Where does a dollar go? We can figure that out pretty quickly. It doesn't happen in quite as explicit a manner. And then the last comment I'll make very quickly simply has to do with providing transportation options linked to employment for those who can't afford a car, don't have a car, don't have access to information and data that allows them to get information on doctors and what transit times would be, even if they had such services. So those are the kinds of things that we should look at and ask over time if there's other than decisions that are being made or driven by other than what we would see as sort of following the rules and the policies. But at the end of the day, there's inequity that is clearly obvious.
And let me just jump on this one more. I know you want to get to the questions, but I agree completely with Professor Ross, Dr. Ross, on this, in the sense that you may have a process that you think is addressing the problem, but if you don't measure it to try to see if outcomes wind up taking you to a different place, it may not be. So you actually have to really pay attention and understand what the goal is, and then see whether whatever approach you're taking is achieving that goal.
Right.
Absolutely. All right. Two questions that are somewhat a little similar. I'm going to ask them together, even though they're both a little layered. But one is for Raphael, from Raphael Bostic, our former provost here at Georgia Tech. Raphael, would you agree that policies of the government/Fed have exacerbated the income gap? Policies dealing with interests and money supply could be argued to favor the wealthy. Regulations, on the other hand, are at times punitive and reactive. So his question is, are there any incentive-based policies that work? So that's kind of question number one from Raphael. Somewhat similar, Mike Messner writes, the Fed uses interest rate policy as its primary tool for assisting the economy. But doesn't lowering interest rates, as the Fed has done since the financial crisis, exacerbate income inequality by inflating financial assets? So is the Fed considering other tools besides just lowering interest rates? So I still felt, even though we brought up interest rates, I still thought it was fair to ask. He's not really asking about the interest rates. He's asking what the other tools are. But I think, both of these are sort of are asking whether, in what ways the Fed is sometimes tripping over itself in what it's trying to do.
Yeah, so I get this question fairly regularly. And the way I think about this is, there are two types of inequality. There is wealth inequality, which I think both questions really focused on, and the idea that if you have assets and assets appreciate and other people don't have assets, inequality is going to widen. And that's just math. That is actually true. And our policies can't actually change that dynamic in the sense that we don't decide who has assets and who doesn't. But what I would say, and this is an important thing, I don't think you can get assets if you don't have a job. And if you don't have a job that pays a good salary such that you can start to have savings. And one of the things that we have done at the Federal Reserve in the last, about 8 months ago, was we issued a revised statement of long-run principles for how we were going to execute monetary policy. And one of the things we said there was that we're going to not preemptively raise interest rates before we see that the economy is overheating. And the reason why that's important is that our rates will stay lower for longer. And what that will mean is that there will be more opportunity for people to get jobs and to be more permanently attached to the economy. We used to be very preemptive. And one of the things we should just note on this is that what we saw in the Great Recession and this recovery, the last people to benefit were minorities, ethnic minorities, and lower income people. So by not being preemptive, we're increasing the likelihood that people from those backgrounds will get those jobs, which will then allow them to ultimately start to earn assets and then participate in the growth of this country. So I really view this as a two-step process. You got to have a job so that you can get assets. And then once you have assets, now you can participate. And, the other reality, and this is one thing to remember in this space, the disparities that we're talking about have evolved over decades. These are not things that just emerged in the last 2 or 3 years. And so solutions in this are going to also require an extended period of time, and we've got to have that proper time horizon in our mind as we move forward. Now, for Provost Bostic, Professor Bostic, I don't know if you still call him Provost at this point, there are many incentive type programs that are effective. The one that came to mind for me was the Earned Income Tax Credit. We have found that that has been quite effective in getting lower income families to participate in the labor force and to get jobs. Now, with all these programs, there's always a challenge of maximizing participation, and there's a whole literature on that. But the evidence is pretty clear that those kind of incentives are actually effective in getting people to different economic stations.
So building a little bit on that, just the sort of the gap between rich and poor, the gap between big capital and then small business or small entrepreneur. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the ways that the community development arm of the bank is working to, possibly sort of really push the envelope, maybe allowing for community ownership models, facilitating incremental development by local residents. We have a question here by John Anderson, who leads the Incremental Development Alliance, on, is there progress in cultivating local small developers, specifically Black and brown small developers, to work on smaller scale projects in distressed areas? And are there programs that often it's that those sort of, it feels like economic policy in general in the country is only helping the stock market do great and then and increase the divide. So tell us a little bit more about different ways you see really helping the small business, small development, small scale capital.
So let me talk about this in a couple of different ways. And the first thing I want to just say is, the Federal Reserve doesn't run programs in the way that I think most people think about it. We don't have pools of money that we can deploy to projects and local communities the way that the Department of Housing and Urban Development might, or other federal agencies. What we do have, though, is an ability to connect people who are in these communities with experts around the country who know how to get things done, who have enough experience and who have knowledge to really serve as advisors. So in some ways, we can be connective tissue to help those in small places link up with others who can help them be more successful. Another thing that we've really tried to work on is increasing the participation of philanthropic organizations in communities in the Southeast. Right before I got this job, our bank issued a report that showed that national philanthropies underinvest in the Southeast relative to the amount of need. And one of the efforts that we've had continuously since I've been here is to engage with philanthropies to say, look, there is a lot of need here. There are really creative ideas, and there are efforts that warrant and merit their support. And we are continually working with them. And I'm pleased to say that since I've been here, a number of them have opened offices in Atlanta and have identified the southeastern cities as places that they want to do work. So there is an opportunity for us to play that role as well. And then the last thing I would say is we're also doing research on these issues, whether it be things like heirs property law, which we know translates into the stripping of or the loss of land from African Americans in particular because of the lack of title and wills. These types of things are things that we research, and we promote the building of communities that then come up with solutions that can be deployed at the state level and at the local level to try to make progress. And the heirs property stuff with Thomas Mitchell, he was just named a MacArthur Genius. He has gotten laws passed in a number of states to try to protect and preserve ownership of land by African American families, which is a super important way that wealth can be preserved and passed on through generations.
I'd like to kind of start to bring the conversation a little bit back to redesigning cities, and but only first off, just in the same sense though that I think urban designers and planners tend to look at this sort of big picture and try to see how all the parts come together. And Tate, a professor at RISD, asks, I think in reference to when you described Raphael, the homeless, and how, the solution doesn't benefit the person who's paying for it, kind of those models. Anne asks, are there new models for whole system accounting that can make visible the joint gains of improving housing or education as they impact healthcare or public safety costs?
So, that's an interesting. Go on, Dr. Ross.
Very quick comment in this regard. I spoke recently, and one of the things that strikes me is that the kinds of policies that we're developing don't allow the evaluation metrics to link those in a way that reflects the connectivity that's actually there. So I made an observation that we could simultaneously perhaps solve transportation, housing, and health issues. Now, that's a big statement to make. And it speaks to the question that's on the table right now. But what I'm suggesting is that, a long time ago, location efficient mortgages, for example, tried to link affordability and housing and access to transit so you get a more favorable borrowing rate, et cetera. So one of the, I think the answer to that is largely no. We can talk about it because I don't think we develop, we don't ask for evaluation, we don't implement policies that really link these in the way in which this hyperconnectivity is upon us. We are very far behind with regard to our ability to actually take advantage of that, measure it, develop policies that recognizes that, whether it's across 3 or 5 different sectors. So I'm a bit put off by our slow progress in that regard.
So the one exception I would offer, and this is really around governance. The last 3 years I was at USC, I ran the Bedrosian Center on Governance in the Public Enterprise, is when you have organized your governments such that all those line items are on the same budget. So I think about the city of San Francisco, for example. It's also the county of San Francisco. So while a lot of the health money goes to the county, the housing money goes to the city, but because it's the same people who run both, they see both line items and they can internalize the savings and they recognize it. And then they can do that adjustment. But that is an unusual governance arrangement and not one that is so frequently employed in the United States. You think about Atlanta, where we have a regional commission, but we still have a lot of individual cities that have their own line items, their own individual sources of funds. The type of coordination that would be required here is much more difficult. And so we're going to have to think about the governance solution. But the other thing that I will just say on this is I actually think that, and this, we talked about private sector, this is an area where private sector is starting to understand the benefits. I think a year and a half ago, we were instrumental in a conversation between the major health providers in the Atlanta region and got them to sign a pledge that they were going to be willing to invest in housing because they recognized that those housing investments would reduce the amount of asthma and the amount of high blood pressure and a whole bunch of other things that they were spending a lot of money on. And they took it upon themselves to be part of a coalition of change agents. So I think that there are multiple ways to get at this. I think because of the budgetary challenges, the public sector may be harder, but there, I think, are some other alternatives. And this is another place where the evidence base can be very helpful. We can show through our research that where the savings are and that they're substantial. That can definitely get people's attention.
That's the major opportunity we have in front of us, I think, to do that, to be effective in that way. I agree.
So, and well, Catherine, with all your work on transportation in cities is fundamental to getting all the access to opportunity that we need to get the economy going. Yet right. Transportation investments in particular have often segregated our cities and blown up thriving Black, we've put the highways right through the thriving Black communities. So nowadays there's at least some discussion about possibly reparations to those communities. There's some discussions about the need for much more transportation investment in especially low-income communities. Where do you see those discussions, and are there opportunities? You said you expressed your skepticism about really being able to link these things economically, but anything in particular in the transportation world that?
So, a couple of thoughts, and I'm not so much saying we can't do it. I'm suggesting we haven't, and that's an opportunity in front of us. And I agree that the private sector can be a significant player in that regard. To give you one example, right now you have to have 50,000 population to be considered an MSA. And we have the Atlanta Regional Commission. So there's a new piece of legislation, I haven't tracked it the last week, but that says, oh, well, now we should go up to 100,000. Okay, and what does that mean? It means if you're 100,000 population, you're now MSA. And what does that mean? It means you still get certain resources from transportation, USDOT. But if you're under that threshold, it goes to the state. I mean, those are the kinds of issues that I'm suggesting have to be on the table in terms of our solutions. So if in fact that proposal moves forward, let's just assume it doesn't. I'm not sure it will. What then is the policy that would speak to those places that are 95,000? For example, typically what we do is we say 100,000, that's it. And I understand that there have to be limits, but there also is an opportunity to be flexible in that regard. And I think that means more inclusivity. So that's one observation that I would share. Transportation, I think, is going to be interesting to watch. The transportation, the infrastructure bill we have in front of us is proposing to do some things we haven't done in quite a while. More investment in transit. You know, out of surface transportation dollars, 80% go to highways and 20% for transit. We have to redesign cities, putting people back in cities and putting in mobility systems. It's not a car or the bus. It is emerging technologies that meet different kinds of needs. So you have urban-centric, smaller systems that move people around that are driverless, for example. So I think the technology will give us a way to improve transportation delivery at different levels for different needs. And so I'm hopeful and optimistic that first of all, everything's falling apart. We got to see what C minus square. We got to fix what we have. But we also can't spend all of that money so that we can't take advantage of new technologies and new opportunities. And I worry a bit about that because the voices that are quite effective are those that have been there for a long time. And they're very powerful lobbyists, as you know, that influence everywhere what the outcome is. It goes back to my notion about what are we doing by measuring the tailpipe, what actually comes out at the end. So I would make those observations. I've lobbied very heavily for transit and more money. Not that everybody needs to take a bus, but it does mean if you have no opportunity to access a job, to go back to what Raphael has been saying relative to having a job so that you can talk about accruing wealth. If you can't access a job, then you're virtually trapped. There's very little for you to be hopeful about.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of city government, municipal government, especially zoning, land use. I mean, they have been so critical in basically getting us to a very segregated and a racist system of wealth accumulation. City of Atlanta, we are starting to see more and more cities think about not banning exclusively single-family home zoning. We're seeing discussions, of other ways of trying to sort of, especially using the tool of zoning, but to level the playing field economically. Any thoughts of, how do all of these different funding levels and administrative sort of levels at which the economy works, and yet zoning is still right there handled by cities? Any ways to link those two, or just encourage more cities to use their tool of zoning?
Well, I don't think we're going to significantly move away from land use being determined at a local level.
Right.
I think we're going to have to engage with planning commissions and with those who oversee zoning policies. For me, I think there are really two pieces to zoning that we should think. Well, you mentioned the third one, but I think, are we zoning such that neighborhoods are really credibly accessible to everyone? Or are we zoning in a way that really means that developers and others need to charge large sums of money in order to get the returns that the market requires of them to get? And if that's the case, then we're going to really have to think about what that means. A second piece to this, and when I moved, I lived in Los Angeles before I moved here, and in LA, lots are tiny. And I moved out here, and I'm driving around neighborhoods, and there is a lot of land per lot. And yet we still just have one house on each of these lots. And I think about properties that are owned by African Americans and the potential that that land could be used more intensively to get them more cash flow, to increase its value, and to create some more diversified sources of income that can leave them more resilient. So zoning that prevents that from happening as well also is potentially problematic, and we should be thinking about that. I was talking with some folks in Eastlake maybe a year and a half ago, and they were thinking that the tiny home might be a solution because there's a relatively low overhead to build, so it won't be as costly, but it could be placed on a number of these large lots in ways that create some supplemental income. I thought that was an interesting idea.
It is.
But we have to think about whether there are barriers in zoning that would prevent that, or what types of things would have to happen in terms of zoning to facilitate that and to allow that to happen. So it's those sorts of conversations that I think are important, and they're particularly important, I think, for a lot of historically African American neighborhoods where people have not fully participated in the growth of the city. This is a way to make sure that they potentially do not get left behind.
There is an element of racism that's afloat, which goes something like this. If we began to do that, then a lot of minority-owned homes will have access. So there is a fear that it will bring the people we don't want, quote, into some of these neighborhoods because I don't have to own it now. I can rent a tiny home and I'm there. So there's a lot of discussion and research that is being undertaken now that accepts that race is one of the issues that has to be considered when we begin to talk about the really hard focus on tiny homes right now and on making sure that some of the land that we have can be used more intensely. There is an element of race that has to be, I think, part of that conversation.
I think there's a lot of conversations that we could and should continue to really be having. The questions just keep coming in, but we really have kind of run out of time. I had questions I was going to ask, but I think at this point I am going to thank you very much, both Raphael and Catherine, and I'm going to share my screen again. Just a second. Go to share screen. There we go. And really, I want to encourage listeners who are interested in subscribing to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's weekly digest. All you need to do is you text FRBA and then in the message put 33777. Real tremendous thank you to Dr. Raphael Bostic of the Federal Reserve and Dr. Catherine Ross of Georgia Tech. You've been listening to episode 20 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. Many of our audience members are not schooled in economic policy, but care deeply about inclusive cities. And both of you have, I think, just opened our eyes to the work that we all need to be engaged in as we tackle structural racism. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.